move on to before we move on to the presentations, does anyone have any announcements to share? I'll leave a few minutes. I don't see any hands raising, so if you do, just leave it in the chat. So without further delay, our first speaker this afternoon is Michelle Stockness, Executive Director of Freshwater, with the presentation, What's New in Water? You may now share your screen, Michelle.
All right, can everyone see that? All right, thanks everybody. I'm here to talk about the election. No, just kidding. I'm not talking about the election. So this is your palate cleanser for the day, right? My name is Michelle Stockness. I'm the newish Executive Director of Freshwater. I joined about a year and a half ago. And my background, I'm a civil engineer. My background is a consulting engineer working with water systems and water cleanup for cities, industries, and community groups. So I'm here today to talk about what's happening at Freshwater, and I'll give you a little more details as we go here. Hold on. Okay, so the things I'm going to talk about today are what's Freshwater working on, and what are we up to lately? Freshwater's been around for a while, so we work on different things all the time. So helping you understand that a little bit more. I'm going to focus on water circularity, water reuse, talk a little bit about source water protection things we're working on, and preview some changes to the Minnesota Water Stewards Program. And so I'd love your feedback on that as we go too. So my goal with this today is there's a lot of people working on water. That's the tangly part on the left there. A lot of people are doing a lot of different things in water. My goal today is to help you understand what Freshwater is up to, and hopefully you like what we're doing, and maybe you see opportunities for us to partner together or collaborate together on something in the future. So I have to give the obligatory blurb about Freshwater. I finally got this done after a year and a half. So our mission is to inspire and empower people to value and preserve water. Freshwater is a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been around since 1968, started out in the Lake Minnetonka area as a biological research institute. There's our founder, Dick Gray, in that photo. So we've morphed over the years and kind of identifying what's needed and then changing to that. So now we are a nonprofit located in St. Paul, and our budget's between $1 to $2 million each year, and we have 14 staff and contractors. An important thing I think to remember about Freshwater is that we work with a lot of different groups. So I think this is one of the main reasons I joined, actually, is because I like that we connect across all the different groups. So we have relationships with community groups, the media, they're not all that bad, other nonprofits, local units of government, state government, and especially policymakers in the legislature, federal governments, and tribal nations, and then a lot of educational partners and a lot of relationships with private industry. So we feel like you need to work across all those groups in order to get things done, which is fun and complicating. How we do these work, this is my, my elevator speech for how we do our work. We have three main buckets: community education and engagement, water research, and water policy. We do have a paid lobbyist at the Capitol that we work with every year too for each legislative session. So we're fairly involved in the policy side too. So there's a lot of different things that we could be doing at Freshwater. And what we've been looking at lately is trying to identify what's getting done and working really well already, and maybe where are there gaps and where can we add a little bit more attention or focus. So our three focus areas that we're working on this year and next year are the first one is safe and clean water for all communities, and especially for rural Minnesotans, BIPOC communities, and tribal nations. The second one is groundwater sustainability with a focus on restoration, governance, and protection. And the third one is water system adaptation and resiliency in response to climate change. Andy's probably going to talk about this more in his presentation next, but trying to make sure that water is involved in climate change discussions. I've had a lot of people say, oh, we're working on climate change, but that's not water. So just making sure it's part of those discussions too. So let me give you a quick update on water circularity and some efforts we're doing there. So these kind of go with the groundwater sustainability, safe and clean drinking water for all focus, and adaptation to climate change. Um, and so we define water circularity as water conservation and efficiency, water reuse, and water recharge. So this may be newer to this part of the country. It's not as new to other parts of the country, but we think this area needs a little bit more focus. So here's some things we're doing for that. We're trying to really push the circular water economy and promote best practices for water circularity. We've been participating on the state stormwater capture and use committee that I think the final report, I'm told, will be out in this month. If you've been following those activities. We had a June workshop with Bar Engineering, just giving an update on water reuse across the state. We had some fall site visits, which I'll show some pictures of next. And we have an upcoming State of Minnesota's Circular Water Economy, a white paper coming out this month sometime. So we're working with various partners on this and various grants, but we're really trying to highlight best practices around water circularity. And here's some more details. So we did host stormwater reuse site visits to the cities of Waconia and Hugo and Woodbury in September and October. We had about 20 people show up to each site visit. Let's see, on the left top is Woodbury, and then, or sorry, Hugo. And then below that is Hugo's system on the bottom left. In the middle is some design standard and a photo of Woodbury's system, one of their systems. And on the right is Waconia's system. So we're trying to have a learning space where people can ask questions about design and operation maintenance and monitoring and kind of share best practices and knowledge. We had about 20 people show up to each event that ranged from watershed organizations, cities, residents, policymakers, state regulators, state agency people. So yeah, that was super fun. Another thing we're doing around water circularity is we're looking at a managed aquifer recharge. Again, this is common in other parts of the country, but it's kind of new for us. So we currently don't allow this as a state, unless you get an EPA variance. So we're working with the University of Minnesota on a study to better investigate recharge potential and do some field work on this. So that is a project, an LCCMR project with the University of Minnesota that's happening now. And I'm blasting through these just to, this is more of a FYI awareness, just maybe put questions in the chat if you have them, and I'll have plenty of time for questions later. So those are some water circularity efforts, and maybe I'll talk next around source water protection. And in my mind, I define source water protection is protecting sources of water, surface water or groundwater, and also water quality and water quantity. So one sort of big new thing we're doing is called Greater Lakes Promise. This is across EPA Region 5, so all the Great Lakes region. And we're looking at taking corporate stewardship dollars from corporations and using that to work with land trusts around the whole Great Lakes region and use that money for land conservation. So we're pairing that, businesses maybe that have a strong value or that use a lot of water, have a, strong value of water, and using some of their donations to set aside land for conservation that protects the water quality of the Great Lakes. So this is a new project we've just started. I think we're on year 2 of 5 of it, and it's working with multiple land trusts across the Great Lakes region, including the Minnesota Land Trust. So I'll send a link out to this website, but if you know private businesses that really care about water and like want to know something to do with it, this is a great new effort that we're helping to lead. Another thing when we're looking at source water protection and especially around groundwater, what we've been doing the last 2 years is to host workshops with tribal nations across EPA Region 5 and local units of government that use groundwater or do groundwater research. And so we've been pulling them together in 5 different sort of, we call them aquifer action clusters is our nerdy name, but we're getting workshops together of people that use the same groundwater in a region and maybe haven't talked before. So a lot of this is working with tribal nations and then working with people like water utilities, USGS, DNRs in different states, and getting them together in a room to have a shared understanding of how they use water, how they value water, what data do they collect. And the goal isn't to have regulation come out of this or anything, but it's to have a shared understanding about how we use and govern water together. so that we can work better together in the future. We've had 3 big meetings on this and they've been really well received. We're really happy to have tribal nations be such a strong participant in this. And I think everyone together has learned a lot from convening in this way. Another thing that we're focusing on is private well support. I bet a number of you have been working on this too, but I think this is an area where as a state, we're realizing we need some more support and more screening. So this isn't something new, but I think it's a new effort that we're working on as a state. So we're trying to support private well owners. This is also, all these projects are with multiple partners too, but we're trying to help with more education, water quality screening, and testing and treatment support. These are private well owners that are often, they're not part of a community system. They're not offered the same protections or staffing. Sometimes they need help screening and interpreting the test results or, navigating how do they get funding? How do they know if they should put treatment in or not? Especially in areas with nitrate or arsenic contamination is where we're focusing on this. So there's some photos on the left is just a screening we participated in with the Minnesota Well Owners Association, MNWO. I think a lot of you have worked with them too. They're great. So we're trying to just assist and promote there. The left and then the bottom is also one of the screening clinics that we helped with, just interpreting the data and helping people understand groundwater a little bit more. And in the top, it's a different angle maybe to think about private well support is we testified twice at the state legislature this last year around nitrate contamination. It's not naturally occurring in really high concentrations. And this is the science behind how it gets in your groundwater. And this is some information about nitrate and public health and drinking water. So we're trying to be a voice of science to help policymakers make better decisions around groundwater and nitrate contamination that really affects private well users. And I think a lot of this got a lot of attention in the legislature this past year with the EPA petition in Southeast Minnesota. So we're glad people are focusing on this and paying attention to it. And here's maybe 2 other projects we're working on. I thought I'd give you a preview of. We're going to help with drinking water and arsenic testing in private wells in Southeast Minnesota. This is with MNWO, USGS, and Mayo Clinic. This is the fascinating part for me for working across groups. But, a doctor at Mayo was realizing how arsenic is a really critical contaminant for her patient's health and how she's thinks that we don't talk about it enough. So we're glad to have their support in something like this. So that'll be kicking off next year for LCCMR 3-year workshop to help people with testing for arsenic. And then we also have a PFAS biofilm mediation study that we're helping Bay West with around groundwater. So trying to help where there's gaps and needs. So that's around source water protection. And lastly, I'll talk about Minnesota water stewards. So this is the part where I'd love to have your feedback too. I love to have your feedback on anything we're doing, but especially this part. So many of you are probably familiar with water stewards. I think I knew about it before I joined Freshwater, but I know a lot more about it now. So here's some photos of water stewards over the years. This is the 11th year that water stewards has been going on. And we're trying to educate volunteers and leaders to make a difference in water. I think the whole premise that I've heard from Peggy Knapp and Steve Woods was that people care about water, so what? So what should they do? So we're trying to give them some more education, leadership development so they can do more in their communities. To date, these have been funded through partner organizations, mostly watershed districts, and a few small grants we've had. We've had 23 partners over the years, watershed districts, counties, cities, and other nonprofits. And over 11 years, we have certified over 500 water stewards, which is pretty amazing. So I think the picture is on the top is maybe last year's graduating cohort. On the bottom is this year's graduating cohort. And on the right is, I think, a team doing their capstone hours. So what the program is today, just to refresh all of your memory, we provide a basic understanding of water science, water governance and policy, skills for community engagement and leadership, especially listening to needs and working with people. We provide an awareness of water issues, especially topical water issues, what's new or things they should know about. We provide them an opportunity to network with their local watershed organizations. And then there's options that they can take action and do a capstone project in their communities. And then new this year, we've also been offering continuing education and events to get those graduated stewards together with the new students and keep learning and engaging together. So that's where we're at today. And how it's worked today is that a local unit of government, the ones I mentioned before, would sponsor partners and work with volunteers as their kind of host partner um, for the stewards to graduate. So we've been trying to collect feedback on how this program has been working. Over the years, we've noticed fewer stewards and we've noticed less funding coming in. So this is a red flag that we need to get some more feedback and see what's going on. So the feedback we've heard from partners is that partners value and rely on their stewards in their communities, which is great. They recognize the impact of stewards on their boards and staff and other roles. Incidentally, the number of people that have come up to me and said, I was a water steward back in the day, or I was a water steward and then I got this job or something like that. That's always pretty amazing to me. More people come up to me and say that than you'd think. So that's pretty cool. We've also heard that partner organizations have really limited capacity for volunteer management and new volunteer management. Everyone doesn't have enough time and they feel like they can't work with their water steward student as much as they would like. And we also see that partner organizations want to spend more time cultivating work with their existing stewards or partners also, and that's competing priorities. We've noticed lately that stewards are mostly from the metro, that there's less stewards coming through the program now. Our funding sources have changed or decreased over time. And then we also hear this need for more support across the state, especially with implementation of watershed plans. So this is the feedback we're getting, and we're trying to think of how can we, everything needs to adapt. This is the 11th year of the program. It's adapted a lot over those years. So we're trying to think of what are the next ways that maybe we should look to adapt this program. So here's what we're considering. We'd like to change the program so that's widely available across the state and region. And so it's a little bit more affordable for people and a little bit has a better sustainable funding source. So we'd like to change it so that anyone, anywhere can participate in Minnesota. It would be a fee-based program, kind of like Master Gardeners. There's online courses, annual meetings, and continuing education. But in this way, anybody that has an interest in water can learn more and apply to the program, complete the course, choose at least one action step, and then be certified. And it would remove that barrier of having to have that local sponsoring partner spend quite as much time with you. We still hope to network together, but they wouldn't have to be as closely involved. And also, we'd like to lower the cost of the program a little bit so it's more accessible to anybody without that partner sponsor. So that's one of the major changes. The second one, we would like to make it customizable curriculum based on local needs. I wrote this last night and I was distracted with the election, so I forgot the word needs right there. But we think that water is very regional. Issues are very regional. What's important in northern Minnesota is different than southeast, different than central. So we think there's different modules that you might want to customize the training, kind of like when you were in high school and you took electives, right? You had your core curriculum and then you maybe wanted to optimize different learning that you needed for your local community. So we'd like to make more customizable curriculum and add a few more modules. Maybe it's around private well education. Maybe it's about tribal engagement, things like that, that maybe we could offer a little bit more learning and support that's of interest to the specific community that you live in. And then, lastly, we want to identify that, some organizations still maybe want to recruit and train a specific cohort to do something. Maybe a board of a watershed organization wants to get training. Maybe mayors want to get training. Maybe there's a shoreline training that needs special training in their region for some new training method they're doing. So we want to still offer that, but it's not a requirement of that. So we're sort of changing it and sort of making it open and flexible. Some other ideas we've looked at is looking at the possibility of maybe including younger stewards or high school students maybe as a sort of a workforce development and training opportunity. I've heard a number of people say that water stewards was helpful for them for finding their, eventual career in water. So we want to enable that. We're just trying to figure out how we can best do that. So that's what we're proposing to do. I'd love to hear your feedback on those proposed changes. You can email me or call me at any time too about this, or put it in the chat. Or if you have any other ideas for what we're working on, especially water stewards adaptation or any other projects we're working on, I'd love to hear your feedback.
Anyone can feel free to come off mute and leave any questions. We definitely have some time to discuss and talk and ask around.
And I am tired today. I stayed up too late last night with the election, so I understand if you're tired and quiet too. I see in the chat, Stan says he likes the idea of the water steward program, kind of like the master gardener program. And we did talk with them and kind of hopefully going to use some lessons learned from them and model the program like that too. And Gail says she likes the idea of making it local. And yeah, we really think that water is not one size fits all across Minnesota. So I think making it really applicable to where you live is super important.
It's not working? Oh. Sorry. I was.
Gail, you might be on mute if you're trying to ask a question.
Okay, well, with that, please reach out at any time. I am still I'm going to say I'm new in this job for like the first 5 years, so I'm still new, even though it's my second year. But I'd love to hear your feedback on, what we're doing. I think Freshwater as a nonprofit, has different influence than local units of government or policymakers or anybody, because we can kind of work across those groups. So we are really trying to evaluate what would be most helpful for us to do. What are the needs? Where are we uniquely positioned to support or lead something? So we really are open to your ideas about how we can help your organizations and needs that you have. And we work with a ton of partners in a lot of different roles. So if you're ever wanting to bounce some ideas off us, we can certainly be happy to talk or help you navigate or connect with others too.
Thank you, Michelle. And we'll have time at the end if you have any questions pop up and during our next presentation to circle back. So thank you again. Next up, we have Andy Erickson, Research Manager at St. Anthony Falls Lab. We'll be speaking on the threat of climate change to urban stormwater infrastructure. And thank you, Andy, for sharing your screen.
Very good. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with you all this afternoon. It's great to see some familiar names in the audience and also some names I don't know. So I'm excited to connect with all of you on this. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and extreme weather and how it has impacts on our urban stormwater infrastructure. And I really appreciate Michelle's talk. You mentioned a little bit about extreme weather, and we're going to talk about that. And I actually learned a new connection that we have. I'm working on something within the University of Minnesota on water circularity. So Michelle, I'll be connecting with you and we can kind of see how we can synergize on that effort too. But I'm going to cover some ideas around extreme weather, and this shouldn't really be news to anyone. I just Googled this actually here as we were getting prepared for this meeting. And there are always consistently many news articles related to extreme weather within the last several days at any given time. It's amazing how much extreme weather is happening all over the world. We are experiencing it, we are reading about it, and we are seeing the ramifications and impacts on our urban landscapes and on our communities due to extreme weather. So it's something that we need to pay attention to. We need to think about the future as we try to build resilience in our communities in light of these extreme weather events. And there are many different projections about what extreme weather will look like as we go into the future. I'm going to talk a little bit about historical data versus today versus future forward looking. But this is just an example of looking at changes between 1958 and 2012. So again, this is even backward looking, how it's changed from the mid 19th century or the mid 1900s to what it is close to today. And every part of the country in the US is seeing an increase in the heaviest or largest rainfall events. Even the arid Southwest is seeing a 5% increase. Where we are in the Midwest, we are looking at possibly a 37% increase on average. And that's pretty consistent
Here's your
depending on
output.
what data you look to or what studies you read. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit of work that we did looking specifically for Minnesota at the historical, current, and future predicted precipitation, and then how we might adapt our stormwater infrastructure in response. So what you're seeing here on the right side of my slide is a figure where we have listed out the Atlas or the TP40 rainfall numbers for Duluth, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Rochester, Minnesota. TP40 was published in 1961, so it was looking at data prior to 1960. Atlas 14, which was more recently published and looking at more recent decades, but still published starting in about 2006, and really only looking at the end of the 1900s, early 2000s at best for historical data. And we did look at global climate models or general circulation models or global circulation models, depending on what you believe GCM stands for. We actually looked at 35 different GCMs to think about what is the near future, the mid-century, and the end of this current century predictions for what rainfall might be. And I don't necessarily expect you to be able to read the text or even look at the individual numbers on this chart on the right of the slide, because I've highlighted on the next slide a few really interesting things that we've learned when looking at this. And what we did is we took all of those values for all three of these cities and we sorted them from the smallest to the largest. And when we looked at the small storm events, the frequent events, which is typically in our stormwater world, our design events, our water quality design events, the 2-year and the 10-year event, what was very, very interesting is that Atlas 14 numbers for these relatively frequent small events are actually smaller than TP40 numbers. What does that mean? If you're not an engineer or not a hydrologist and not familiar with these terms and studies and reports that are out there, what this means is that recent historical precipitation is showing that these small events are actually smaller today than they were prior to 1960. Smaller events today are smaller than they were in the mid-1900s. And the converse is also true. If you look at larger events, the 25-year and above, these are rare events that might only have a 4% chance or 2% chance or even 1% chance of happening in any given year. What we're seeing is an increase compared to what we saw in the mid-1900s. TP40 for these three cities on average was projecting a 100-year event, a storm event that only has a 1% chance of happening in any year, was at about 5.9 inches of rainfall within 24 hours. Atlas 14, which is recent historical precip, think about the last 30 years, is saying that number now is close to 7 inches, which is a pretty extreme increase. And if you think about looking into the future, into the mid-century and beyond, the projections are saying even more rain will fall in 24 hours on these low frequency, relatively rare, or you might say extreme weather events. And if you want to think about increases, like how big of an increase is this? We actually see pretty consistently that our small storms are smaller today. Our big storms are getting 20 to 30% bigger today than they were in the mid-1900s. And what does this mean for us? Well, what you might not realize is that much of our stormwater infrastructure, our pipes that are in the ground conveying stormwater off of our streets, were designed with numbers from TP40, from data that was prior to the 1960s. So the rain events we are seeing today are very different than the storm events all of our stormwater infrastructure was designed with. But you can also think about this in a little bit different way. You can say small storms are smaller and bigger storms are bigger today. Or you could say we actually are seeing fewer of these small storms and we're seeing more of the big storms. And we experienced that even just this year. We're seeing this, what I've heard some people call climate whiplash. We go from extreme rain, historic snowfall events, and huge snowmelt events to a huge drought in the same year. Even this year, we saw rain and rain and rain and rain and rain in the spring and no snow this past winter. So we're seeing strong changes in our climate. We're seeing more frequent, bigger storms. And it means we have to think about how it has impacts on our infrastructure and how we might design looking into the future. One of the other interesting things to think about is on this frequency. We actually are experiencing, another way to think about it is risk. So TP40, again, was from data prior to the 1960s. What was a 2% chance storm? Only a 2% chance of happening in any given year is actually less than a 4% chance storm today. We've more than doubled our risk for these rare and extreme events. It's the same when we think about even rarer events. The 100-year storm, what was a 100-year storm in the 1950s and 60s, is now closer or less than a 50-year storm today. It has more than double the probability of happening today than it did in 1950. So that means we are seeing these bigger storms more frequently. And really, again, if we want to think about magnitude, how much bigger would our pipes need to be, or our infrastructure, or really our storage? How much more storage do we need in the landscape to prevent flooding? If we're talking about a 100-year event, we're talking 20 to 30% increases. But you all probably remember Houston. You might even remember the Duluth storm in 2012. These are storms that were 500-year events, 1,000-year events. Do we need to be thinking about managing a 500-year event? I mean, it's great to be in the news, but not for the wrong reasons. So we want to make sure that our infrastructure, if we're trying to build resilient communities, we need to have infrastructure that can handle pretty extreme weather because it's happening way more frequently. So what did we do on that front? What did we look at? We actually did some modeling again in these three areas in Duluth and Minneapolis and Rochester. We got 3 sample sub-watersheds with H&H models, hydraulic and hydrologic modeling. And these are different watersheds. It is a pretty good variety of watersheds. Duluth has a fair amount of development in the lower part of the watershed. The upper part of the watershed is generally undeveloped. It's kind of the quintessential Great North Woods area of forested, undeveloped. We have a Minneapolis watershed, which is fully developed. It does have Columbia Heights Golf Course in the middle of it. So maybe the percent impervious isn't a very good representation of kind of Minneapolis old development sub-watershed, but it still gave us a pretty good example of what we see for in terms of built storage within the system. And then, of course, Rochester, thinking about southeast or even southwest Minnesota, part of the watershed is developed with urban, commercial, and residential, but the western part of this particular watershed is ag land. So again, very different semi-undeveloped type watershed. And again, variations in scale. We modeled these for a variety of different storms, all the different storms that I just showed you on the previous slides, we modeled in these watersheds. And we then looked at, we quickly learned, well, I should maybe spoil my own story. We quickly learned that what we're building in our landscape today is simply not enough. It can't handle these events. The events are getting bigger. The storms are getting bigger. The big storms are happening more frequently. These are major challenges for our stormwater infrastructure. So then we looked at what could we do differently going forward? This is getting at a policy question. How should our development rules be set up to build resilient communities? What new funding mechanisms should be put in place to help support building resilient communities? And when that funding's available, how do the communities actually build resilience in their landscapes? And so that's what we looked at. We looked at a variety of different strategies. There's a lot of details here. It's all in the final report, which I'm happy to share. But I'm going to summarize this very simply. We considered the existing infrastructure. If we get hit with a big storm today, what happens? And we said, well, what if we build more storage within our landscapes? What if we take advantage of smart technology? We have smart homes, we have smart cars, we have smartphones, we have smart devices on our wrists. Why can't we have smart stormwater features? So we looked at smart storage. And of course, we looked at green infrastructure. That's a major investment in many of our urban landscapes, is building green infrastructure, restoring natural hydrology. What can that do for our extreme events? And finally, the old adage, the old engineering solution of let's just build bigger pipes. We have more water, let's get more water moving. Let's build bigger pipes and see what happens. So we did model that to show what are the advantages and disadvantages of any of these strategies as we look to the future and try to build resilient communities for these extreme events that we are seeing already today. So again, there's a full report, lots of graphs, lots of figures and data. I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing a lot of that today. These are just some examples. And you can see we did look at a variety of different metrics for what we called flooding or impacts to our urban landscapes. We looked at flood depth. How deep is the water? Can we see impacts into infrastructure? But we also looked at flow rates. How quickly is water moving through the system? Are we creating erosive problems? That was some of the issues that the Duluth area saw under those extreme event that they saw in 2012 was massive erosion and washout of infrastructure. And that's really related to not only the volume of water, but that velocity and building a system that's resilient to those velocities and high flows. So we looked at several different metrics. And at the end of the day, after we looked at all of this, and these were all designed on our current design guidance, because that's the best we have today, all of our conventional design guidance, wisdom, and conventions are simply not enough to prevent flooding. And it's not even the 100-year event. We see flooding in the 10-year events within our watersheds. So I'm not even talking about huge catastrophic events like Houston or Duluth. I'm talking about events that we're designing for. We are still not mitigating because of how storms are changing and the age of our infrastructure and how it was designed for much smaller events in the past. So there's a few things that I want to highlight of what you can do differently. We wanted to ask the question, well, what would it take? If our current design philosophy is not enough, what would we have to implement to build resilient communities? And what this graph is showing is along the horizontal axis is the precipitation depth. So no matter what rain event you're choosing or what watershed you're in, we looked at a variety of different precipitation depths and we said, well, what area of your watershed would need to be built with stormwater infrastructure to prevent flooding, or in other words, future-proof your watersheds to make them resilient? And we looked at a couple different strategies. Let's look first at the 100-year event, and then I'll scale back and we'll talk about the 10-year event. If we really wanted to go out and say, look, we're going to build super resilient communities that really assume a lot of, or reduce our risk of damage of an infrastructure, well, if we had storage in our system, and if that storage was smart storage, and when I say smart storage, what I'm talking about is storage facilities that can fill up, and then through looking at predictions of the weather, use automated valves and control structures to actually drain all that water out ahead of time, or maybe 50% of that water before the storm to allow for more storage. These are systems that are adaptively controlled in real time, automatically, to give us the most capacity. If we built storage that was smart in our watersheds, roughly 9% of the watershed, and this is total watershed, not impervious, total watershed, 9% of the watershed would have to be smart storage if we wanted to be future-proof for the 100-year storm today. 1 out of 11 acres, 1 out of every 11 acres is all smart storage, okay? If it's conventional storage, like stormwater ponds or underground structures, 12% of the watershed. If you want to kind of think about what does that mean for like you, think about your neighborhoods and where you live. That's one lot, one house out of every 8 houses. One house has to be completely taken out, and that's now a stormwater pond throughout your entire neighborhood. If you want to do green infrastructure, we saw 25% of the watershed. One house out of every 4 is taken out to build a giant rain garden, and that's throughout your entire watershed. That's major investments. If we look at our current design guidance in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual or MIDS, typical recommended areas is 5% of the watershed. So these are drastic increases compared to what we are doing today. And this explains why we would see flooding even for relatively small events. Now, you might be looking at me and thinking, Andy, the 100-year event, it's too much. We can't go to that right now. We designed for the 1.1-inch event, the 2-year event, maybe the 10-year event in our conveyance. We have to back off the 100-year. It's just not feasible. It's too much. So let's look at our 10-year event. Even in our 10-year event, which is a common design event for hydraulic structures, certainly, if we are using storage, 5% of the watershed needs to be storage systems. And so this matches with our current design guidance. And our smart storage will give us a little bit of an advantage. But green infrastructure has to be 12% of the watershed. And we were a little surprised by this because we know that green infrastructure helps considerably with managing stormwater runoff. We see many rain gardens, and there's many studies, not only here in Minnesota, but beyond, that show that they can capture pretty large events and infiltrate all that water with no outflow. So why is our modeling suggesting that 12% of our watershed needs to be rain gardens when only 5% can be stormwater ponds? Nobody would build a rain garden if this was true. It just wouldn't be cost effective. So what's going on here? And it made us think. I always kind of think, as I'm in research, I'm always asking, what are my assumptions and how valid are those assumptions? And especially when I see a result like we just saw, I ask the question, is there something wrong? Am I doing something wrong? Am I making an incorrect assumption about the system or even my modeling? And often this is the face I'm making when I'm asking myself these questions as I'm looking at this data. I'm just super frustrated, like, why is this not making sense? And so we went back to some of our formative assumptions and we asked the question, are these valid? This is the rainfall distribution that we use for design. This is a fundamental design assumption, is how quickly the rain falls over that 24-hour period. This is a design standard that's used ubiquitously throughout everything that we do in design. What this does, if you break this down, 90% of the rainfall, this is a 24-hour storm, 90% of the rainfall occurs in 50% of the time. The middle 12 hours holds 90% of the rainfall. 80% of the rainfall falls in just 6 hours. 80% of the rain falls in 25% of the time. 50% of the rain falls in just 1 hour. This is a super intense, highly focused rainfall in the center hour of this 24-hour event. Very high intensities for a short period of time. That's why our rain gardens can't keep up. In the modeling world, we're applying rainfall very, very quickly, high intensities. Rain gardens can't infiltrate water fast enough, especially when we're contributing only 5% of the watershed as rain gardens. They're just overloaded and they bypass. And we see that in the results. When we modeled it in the overall water budget, only 33% of the rain that fell would infiltrate in our pervious areas. Only 8% would infiltrate in our rain gardens, and 60% would run off under that design assumption. So we thought, well, that's just not what we're seeing in the real world. We often see no runoff from our green infrastructure. So, well, we said, why don't we go the other direction? What if we assume a uniform distribution? I also agree this is probably not real. It's not true. We very rarely anymore, at least, get long, slow, kind of continuous rainfall throughout a day. But let's just, for the sake of argument, let's see how much of an impact it would be if that's what we assumed. If we assumed constant rainfall over the entire day, what would happen? We saw drastic changes. Infiltration just in the green spaces, in our front yards, in our parks, in our green spaces throughout our urban landscapes, we saw an increase of 132% more infiltration just in our green areas. This emphasizes the importance of soil health and truly green spaces. We need to protect our lawns and our parks from compaction and other means that might prevent natural infiltration, because they can have a huge impact on the water budget if they're properly maintained. We saw a 37% increase in runoff or infiltration in our rain gardens because we just had a lot less runoff. We only had 11% runoff, 80% reduction in runoff just by changing how quickly the rain falls. The same amount of water fell, same total duration. All we changed is how quickly it fell. And it made a drastic difference in the performance in the watershed. And so what that means is not only do we have to implement new infrastructure, we actually have to reevaluate our design methodologies from the fundamental assumptions. And that's why we actually got a grant recently to reevaluate how our design assumptions reflect or don't reflect real storms. This is, again, that same design intensity, super intense rainfall in the very peak middle part of that 24-hour period. When we look at a Duluth storm from 2012, and now granted this occurred over a couple of days, and there was a relatively large event 2 or 3 days before this rain event. So there's some compounding issues. But if you look at the two hydrographs here, they're nowhere near the same shape or occurrence. So our design storms are maybe a little too conservative. And in fact, many of these were designed such that we're preventing things like dam failures or CSOs, combined sewer overflows, things of that nature. And maybe when we're trying to design green infrastructure, we don't need to go to that level of risk aversion. So we are doing this work. This is actually work that's funded by MnDOT, Minnesota Department of Transportation, through their research steering committee. Has funded research for us to reevaluate how real storm intensity distributions compare to design storms and what implications that might have on stormwater design methodology and philosophy, really, looking forward. So we're working on that. We're in the midst of it. This will take about another 1.5 years or so before we're done with this work. So keep your eyes peeled for that, ears open as we move towards conclusions in that work. But I'm going to summarize with some of the things we've learned. One of the things we learned very, very quickly is that many of our models are actually not calibrated well for these large events. Some of our storms that we put through these models predicted that we had flooding in our roads and in our neighborhoods to depths of 11 feet. And we know in many of these neighborhoods where we modeled, there's never been water like that. And we've seen storms like it. So we know that the models are actually not calibrated well for these low frequency extreme events. And we know that the overland flow paths are misrepresented. We know that water is getting through these systems in the real world in ways that are not represented in our models. So we need to be careful about how our management decisions are relying on our modeling and how strongly that is, because if we have bad information going into our decision-making process, we're going to make bad decisions coming out. We are working on other research that would help improve that. So we're working on tools through GIS and using LiDAR data to create better models that better represent some of these bypass and overflow. So you can see a GIF here image of some of that work and how we're looking at how water moves through the urban landscape via LiDAR data. But we also, as I just showed, know that many of our models do really disadvantage some of our key tools in our stormwater management toolbox, such as pervious infiltration and green infrastructure. In terms of adaptation strategies, as I said, our current design philosophy just isn't enough. We're not even preventing flooding on the 10-year event. And really, if we want to be cost effective, no matter what we currently looked at, more storage is the most cost effective. Although again, as we get through our current project, green infrastructure will, I think, be much more cost effective. And then we'll have to see how it compares to storage. But for many of you that might already live in a fully built out watershed, you might be saying, well, I don't have any more room for more storage. That's where you can think about smart systems. Many of our storage facilities can be retrofitted with smart technologies that can actually increase storage capacity without any new land or really even new infrastructure. It's a relatively minimal cost, and it's very, very cost effective if you can retrofit smart technologies into your existing storage systems. So with that, if this was interesting and useful for you, I encourage you to check out our website and our Stormwater Updates newsletter. There's a QR code here where you can sign up. That's a newsletter where we announce this type of research that we put out, and we share those findings and those results so you can get the latest and greatest information. We also use it to advertise our Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. This is a monthly seminar series where we bring in nationally recognized experts on stormwater management and green infrastructure to give a keynote. Some of you in the room have been panelists because we put these keynote speakers after they give the keynote on a panel of local experts to have a discussion on how to apply these concepts into Minnesota. And I really, really appreciate those of you in the audience that have sat in on those panel discussions. And if any of the rest of you are interested, we'd love to have you. But I encourage you to check that out. It is a hybrid event. You can join in person at St. Anthony Falls Lab. You can find recordings of all of our past events on YouTube. That's also linked here. And you can go online and find the full schedule. So with that, I will offer it up for questions. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate being here, and I am honored to be invited. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andy. Yes, feel free to come up with mute or send them in the chat if you have any questions.
Hey, Andy, thanks so much. That was a really great talk. I guess my question is, we have a PC swim model and we've calibrated for a typical year in the past, although we did not. I think our largest storm event in that time frame was a 3-inch 24-hour event that year. So are you saying basically that one of the things that is helpful for resiliency modeling is to try to do another calibration that would hopefully capture a larger storm event? Or alternatively, what are some other ways that we can get more accurate modeling assumptions out of our existing models? Thanks.
Great question, Mike. Yeah, I think both. So yes, if we can calibrate our models to larger events, that's going to help think about building resilience and understanding how water moves through the system. But I understand that that's challenging. It can be hard to capture data on 10-year events or 25-year or 50-year events. Oftentimes for those kind of big, extreme and rare events, we're just trying to make sure our infrastructure doesn't wash away, right? So I understand the challenges. I can see how it can be difficult to calibrate to those large events, but that is really what we need to do. Even anecdotal evidence of, how deep was the water in the intersection during these events, and roughly what time, was that happening? And I think the cost of structure of sensors coming down and technology being available, I think we might have better information to be able to do those calibrations, to think about how deep was the water. Even aerial photos, we actually on this project, one of our project partners used satellite imagery over some of the stormwater ponds to try to calibrate the model for bigger events happening. So what was the pond water level after the event, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours after the event, to give us a sense of how deep did it get. So there are alternate means to calibrate our models, but that's definitely where many of our models are lacking, is calibration for events larger than, the 2, 5, and 10-year events. I'll say also that I think one of the biggest errors or maybe discrepancies in the model that we saw when we were modeling these larger events is the fact that water is getting through the system in the real world in ways that are not reflected in the model. So it's not that the pipes are wrong and the inlets and outlets are wrong or the weirs are wrong. It's the fact that when the water gets to a certain elevation, it runs down the streets or it runs through people's backyards. And those channels are not reflected in the model properly. We saw nodes and links in the model that represented those bypass, but when they actually experienced extreme flow, they didn't pass water in a realistic way. So I think the intent is there, but we need to be checking that it's realistic. Any other questions or comments?
And I'll open it up for any questions or comments from Michelle as well, just for our last few minutes. Well, with that, we can close out today. A big thank you again to our speakers, Michelle and Andy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we'll see everyone at the next consortium.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.